Good. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Peter Scheer. I'm the Executive Vice President of Corporate Responsibility for JP Morgan Chase. I want to just quickly, in case you don't know who they are, you should just introduce the panel. Mayor Smith of Mesa, Arizona, who's the incoming president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Meredith Whitney, next to him, CEO of Meredith Whitney Advisory Group. Mayor Richard Daley, former mayor of City of Chicago. Rick Caruso, founder and CEO of Caruso Affiliated, and Dan Bitterman, the president of the Bryant Park Corporation and Bitterman Redevelopment Ventures. So as you see, we have a terrific panel of people who have forgotten more about cities than I have ever known. And so we're going to focus on asking a lot of questions. I'm just going to set a quick context for the morning discussion, because we really want to try to make it a interactive discussion, both with the group and with the audience. The perspective that I bring, I've been very involved at JP Morgan in developing a fairly unique initiative with the Brookings Institution called the Global Cities Initiative, which Mayor Daley actually chairs. It's a 5-year, multi-million-dollar effort to work with cities both in the United States and around the world to help provide them with the data and the expertise to become more globally proficient, to understand what their position is in the global economy and how to take best advantage of that. We do this as a company because, as my boss, Jamie Dimon, said in his most recent shareholder letter, the future of humanity is a story of cities. For the first time in the world's history, 50% of the world's population now lives in and around cities. By 2050, that will grow to 70%. Here in the U.S., 2/3 of our population, 3/4 of our GDP comes from just 100 metropolitan areas. If you look at it globally, it's 60% of GDP from just 600 metropolitan areas. And so this mass urbanization that's underway is going to create cities beyond the scale of what anyone could ever have imagined. And the challenges for people who govern and live in and develop and analyze cities is immense, from infrastructure to education to energy and clean water. And what's clear, I think, is that the old way of doing business is not going to work to deal with these new challenges. And so we have a group of people here who can talk about some of the challenges, the fiscal challenges, and talk about some innovative approaches that they're taking to dealing with the problem. So I want to start with Meredith Whitney. I want to ask you, Meredith, to give us a broad landscape. So you have a book coming out in June, in case any of you haven't seen it, The Fate of the States, The New Geography of American Prosperity. And I know you've thought a lot about it. You're obviously writing about it. Talk about the current state, economic state of America's cities and states today, and how high are the stakes in all of this?
Okay, so why I got interested in this, I'm an equity gal. I've spent my career in research, and specifically on the financial institutions. Through covering financial institutions, you see the world, and you see where, because obviously money is the leading indicator of growth. And what was clear to me during the depths of the financial crisis was that things on the other side of the financial crisis were going to look very different from things prior, and it was going to be a regional-based recovery. And what wouldn't happen would be the growth prospects that occurred over the last 25 years, being a real estate and leverage dependent economy. So the economies that were not real estate dependent, were not leverage dependent, were the ones that would flourish. What got me more and more engaged in this thesis was the issue of fiscal and municipal finances. And what was clear was there was not enough money going around. There's a huge disconnect between assumptions and budgets and revenue assumptions and expenses. And what ends up happening is that 49 states are required to balance their budget every year, every 2 years. And if the revenues don't meet the expenditures, they have to cut into what's called discretionary spend. And what is discretionary spend is exactly the items that should never be discretionary, which are education, infrastructure, public safety, public social services. And what then becomes what I call a negative feedback loop from hell is whereby you raise taxes and you cut discretionary spend so that taxpayers are paying more for less. And what is a byproduct of that is companies, which are the basis of the largest portion of tax credits and revenues, then decide to vote with their feet. And Chicago and Illinois has been a sad testament to this in terms of companies trying to get out of a higher tax jurisdiction and moving, in California the same way, and Arizona has been a beneficiary of this, moving to places that are more tax advantageous and more pro-business. And what happens then is cities are left with these horrible consequences whereby there are lower revenues and more demands on social services. So higher structural unemployment and a higher proclivity towards poverty, which is an unsustainable issue. So where are the stakes? The stakes have never been higher because we're an incredibly mobile, transportable economy. And so time has accelerated in ways we've never seen before. So you have an issue of not just state arbitrage, but city arbitrage. And so two mayors are competing, at the jugular to attract businesses, certain states and cities can compete more adeptly than others, and that's what we're seeing now. So, as mayors are taking critical steps to become more competitive, the stakes have never been higher.
So Mayor Smith, let me turn to you and talk about how you're doing this. You've been mayor of Mesa since 2008. You're the incoming president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. As Meredith said, there's not enough money, and you need more money. We see this in Europe every day now. How do you tighten your fiscal belt, which you need to do as a mayor, and provide the type of economic growth that's going to attract jobs and attract industry?
Well, first of all, I'm incredibly depressed after hearing Meredith.
Make us feel better.
But I did learn a new term, equity gal. I'd never heard that, so thank you. It's interesting. It's an interesting experiment as cities because we look at the other levels of government that we have that are, I think everyone agrees, that we can all agree on, it's bipartisan, that government, certainly in Washington, is basically dysfunctional. It's not a whole lot better in many states. Cities don't have that option. We hear about the one or two failings, whether it be a San Bernardino or a Stockton, but those are by far the exceptions. Cities have to pick up the trash. They have, when you pick up the phone and dial 911, the police or fire department are going to show up. And yet, cities have to balance budgets. We don't have the ability to finance operations, which is the greatest blessing I ever had as a mayor, because it completely took that off the table. But we are definitely dealing in a new, what I called, after I took office as mayor of Mesa, which is the 38th largest city in the country. We have over $1 billion budget. We're a big operation. And 3 weeks after I came in, I was brought in the stark reality that basically we had hit our fiscal cliff. Sales tax revenues, which we depend upon mostly for our finance our activities, were headed in the toilet real fast. And we made a very, very conscious decision at that time. We said we can either treat this as a blip or we can decide this is our new reality. And we decided it was our new reality. And from that point forward, we had to look at things different. And I think cities, for the most part across this country, because of the natural constraints that are put on them, and also the demands to keep services up, have dealt with the new reality in a way that's better than any other level of government. We've had to get creative. We've had to look for new sources. The problems and the challenges that we have not only are demographics, not only are the fact that our economy is now very mobile. As a mayor, you know both ends of that. You can see a company pick up and leave and set up shop in another city, another state, another country like that. You can also be the beneficiary of that. But the fact is we have financing systems, we have taxing systems that really are products post-World War II, the 50s, 60s, Eisenhower era type things, and we're dealing in an economy and a reality that is 21st century. In Mesa, for example, we as I said, we're mainly sales tax based. Guess what? Our economy is not the sale of goods based economy, especially then with the internet and things like that. So cities are where the action is, but we're also, I think, where a lot of the solutions are, because we've had to get creative and balance both the new reality on the financial side with the ongoing reality that we have to show up when people want our services.
So let's get into the creative part. So we've got a couple of people down at the other end, Dan and Rick. Dan, you are, if nothing, creative. and you really have been a pioneer in using private funds to help public spaces. Talk about what you did with Bryant Park as the type of creative solution that Mayor Smith and other mayors need, and how that brings in the new sources of revenue that cities need to survive.
Thanks, Peter. It's the first thing I did in my career, and I'm very fond of it, and I still spend time on it. But I'm going back to one conversation that was January 1980. I was a kid, and the chairman of the entity that was going to privatize Bryant Park, this was started by the Rockefellers, by the way, was Andrew Heiskell of Time Inc. Very few people remember him, really smart guy. So he had this habit of leaning back and philosophizing with me. And he leans back and says, "So young man, tell me how much money you think we need to run this park well." And I said, "Well, sir, I have called Disney, Rouse, and Rock Center, and they're each saying $1 million an acre." I don't know how that number resonates with you for the Grove. So he said, "Whoa, how many acres we got?" $6 million bucks. "And how much is the city spending on Bryant Park now?" And I said, $210,000. And he said, "What are they doing with it?" And I said, "Sir, I'm looking around. It looks like they're putting people in trucks who drive to other parks. Most of the time, nobody's picking up the litter. There are killings going on. It's neglected horribly." So he said, "Okay, 210,000 to 6 million. That's 30 to 1. That's bad. And who do you think's spending the money better?" And I said, "Disney, Rock Center, and Rouse are spending the money better than the city of New York." So he said, "Let's put 3 on it. Let's multiply that 30 to 1 offset by 3. So you've got a real job ahead of you. You've got to correct a 90 to 1 offset in effort put into public spaces. So you discover how we're going to close that gap." So we did 2 things. One is we paid and collected at the market prices, which was a challenge because the word market is not used in the Northeast. Mayor Daley has been known to use the word market. In the Northeast governance area, with rare exceptions, you don't hear the word market. You might hear the word market about a grocery project somebody's going to put in. So that was a lot of it, paying and collecting at market. And then second, and maybe we'll get into it later, the role of labor unions in the Northeast and in the West has got to be a subject of this discussion because I looked at the Smart City panel name and I said, smart cities, we should stop doing dumb things. And some of what we're doing is really dumb. So more to speak about later on that subject.
Yeah, and so Rick, you have developed this town center concept. Talk about how, as another way for cities to get creative, seek the type of revenues that they're not getting from traditional sources.
Yeah, happy to. Well, when you go to the Grove, you take a look at the Grove, and hopefully a number of you have gone down the street to take a look at it. It's all about creating an environment that relates to the community. It's about being part of the fabric of the community. It's about creating programming like Dan has done so brilliantly in Bryant Park. I was in Bryant Park last week. I mean, it is spectacular.
Thank you.
You are to be complimented for what you've done.
From you,
Bryant
that's
Park.
important.
Well, it's true. And I think if I can just sort of bring it back to what I think cities need to be doing, is maybe take a cue from businesses that sort of Dan and I deal with every day. And Mayor Daley was a good example of this because we met because Mayor Daley one day walked the Grove while he was mayor of Chicago, and out of the blue called me up and said, "I want to meet with you and I want to figure out how to get something like this going in Chicago." And I think that's the basic premise of where we need to start. I think the basic premise of where we need to start is cities taking cues from businesses and doing what businesses do naturally every day, which is asking their customer, or in the terms of the city, their residents, what they want, what they need, what they would like. And so if you start that from a city's perspective, I think the first answer in today's world is that people, no matter what the demographics are, want something that they can't buy, and that's time. All of us are time constrained, and you can't buy more time. So what we've tapped into on our properties is giving people back a sense of time. And that's because there's better services, there's events to take your family to, you can spend time with your wife, you can spend time with your children, you can actually slow life down. Now what that does from a shopping perspective is people spend more time shopping and they spend more money shopping. But I think one of the things that cities, around the country tend to make a mistake in doing is focusing on the main downtown. And what people, how they really want to live is have multiple centers, because especially in Los Angeles, we are now balkanized. I live in Brentwood. To go from Brentwood to, let's say, the Grove on a Friday night, unfortunately, that could be an hour-and-a-half drive. So if there's more services, more restaurants, more community centers, theaters in Brentwood, that solves your sales tax issue. If cities would actually stop being a barrier to growth and actually be a facilitator to smart growth and say, let's mirror development how people want to live. Because I think today people want to live where they can accumulate some time to be with their families and to be with their friends and slow down life, which means less time driving, being more localized where you can live, work, and play around your home. And I think that is the future of smart cities. It reduces traffic, it reduces the need for public transportation, and it increases sales tax revenue for cities. And you start having an upward spiraling effect. That's what the Grove has done for that part of town.
So let me, Mayor, I wanted to go to the international, but I think we're on a very important track here, and frankly consistent with the whole notion of the Milken Institute Conference to bring together government and business and philanthropic leaders. What we've heard here is the challenges that a mayor faces, the perspective of someone who watches this from Wall Street, how developers have played a role. You were a master in bringing together the private sector and a broader coalition, can I say, of interests to really transform Chicago. How should cities be thinking about facilitating the type of growth that Rick talked about? Many cities look at the business community as just another source of tax revenue, which, as Meredith said, it's only going to get you so far, and at some point that's actually going to harm your interests. How should cities be thinking about the private sector?
Well, first of all, if you look at cities in America, cities were formed first, then the states, then the federal government. But you look at it, the federal government, states have enormous impact, financial impact upon cities. They mandate all the costs to the cities in the federal and state government, both Democrats and Republicans have done that. If we just eliminate most of those, every city would be solid across the country. And you think of that, they mandating everything. And if you look at it now, and what's happening is our cities grew because of immigration. It didn't grow because of migration in China, in India, and Africa. They're just moving 100 miles or 50 miles into cities, and that's what they're doing. But cities are stable. I mean, when we talk about the creative class, you need a good higher education system. You need a cultural activities. You need a business community. Besides that, the people moved out in the 50s and 60s out of cities. The interstate came along and they said, we want a better public education system. If you go across America, every major city has dealt with public education. Middle class have fled. Now, how do you bring it back? When you want to bring middle class people back into the city, the only way to do it is public education. They're not going to support a private system. They cannot afford it. And so that is one area you have to look at if you're going to rebuild American cities from New York to Washington to Atlanta to Los Angeles, San Francisco, all of them. How do you bring the middle class? Besides that, how do you basically have an education system that can take a D student and an A student and it can go to the same school?
So to your point,
and what I look at is basically, we don't compete against New York. I don't compete against that. We compete against Shanghai, Mexico City, Rio. We're not competing anymore. I'm not competing against Dallas or Houston or Atlanta. America has to compete against the world, and we're afraid of it. But mayors and governors are not afraid of it. Federal government's afraid of it. Look at Jerry Brown, Antonio Iglesias here. They all traveled to China. Everybody's going to Mexico City. They're going to Brazil. They're traveling the world to bring investments into their city. They're not waiting for the federal government. And so what J.P. Morgan has done with Brookings has a global initiative. We hear about a year ago, we went to L.A., we went to San Diego and northern Tijuana. We brought them all together and said, how do you compete? How do you export? How do you export medium-sized businesses? How do you get the policies of the federal government changed? And all of a sudden you've seen relationship between mayors. Mayors in China and the rest of the world, 20, 30 million people, they're not waiting for their federal government. They're not waiting for Washington. They're going city to city, region to region, and work with each other. This idea of political barriers in the United States, red state, blue state, pink state, whatever you want to describe it, it should be over with. You have to work with the collar counties. The whole region of Los Angeles, all the way to San Diego, is one region with Tijuana. That is one big region. And if you don't look at it that way, how do you compete? Los Angeles cannot compete. What JP Morgan has done, we go to overseas this year, we're going to Mexico City, we go to Houston, we go to Dallas, we go to Denver. Look at their strengths and their weaknesses. We recently in Atlanta, strengths and weaknesses. And from my perspective, we're not competing against each other. We're competing against the world. And we have to be able to look at that. I think we're afraid of the world. You have to get foreign investments into your city. If you take Europe, why can't you take China and the rest of the world? You have to have more tourists visiting your cities. From China, if they came here, everybody would be working in every city in America. And then what's your philosophy about exporting? Why can't you have middle-sized businesses all over America start exporting in a way that's cost-effective, they can make money and create jobs? And from my viewpoint, this idea, the federal government has never balanced their budget. They tell you, I haven't balanced their budget. I describe the best job in America, be budget director. Come out, business committee. Business committee hires you automatically. You become a hero. But from my viewpoint, cities are doing what is necessary. And to me, the private sector is a key to growth of cities and not-for-profits. You bring them together. Everybody scapegoating teachers. I can't understand America. It's your son or daughter, it's your brother or sister, it's your mother or father. Scapegoating teachers, and when your son flunks an exam or your daughter, you blame the teacher. Only in America do we do that. We don't blame the student, saying, you have responsibility. We're scapegoating everyone. We're afraid of reality. And let's sit down and face reality and be able to make tough decisions. You can't blame all unions for everything. Everybody wants to blame everyone for something. I mean, we could sit here and describe CEOs of America. I mean, talk about problems and abuses. I'd rather work together with people. I'd rather solve people. You can criticize them before negotiations. You're not going to get anywhere. Let's sit down and work it out. And you can work it out on behalf of what is good for, yes, employees, what is good for the city, and what is good for the public.
So, Meredith, was there a point you want to jump in? Because I also there's some place I wanted to go with you too.
Well,
you go ahead first.
A couple of things. The single largest correlation between poverty and anything else is employment, and the single largest correlation between unemployment and anything else is education.
Right.
So the issues of education are front and center, and how do we pay for that? And education is what is the competitive is really the crux of the competitive issue with cities, and be it cities competing against other cities in a state, or cities competing against other cities in a country, or country to country. And I think the 800-pound gorilla out there is privatization, because we have the facility, and I believe very strongly we have the tools in front of us and the resources in front of us, but we don't have the political will to privatize assets. So if an average American, and the issues of government really can be boiled down to kitchen table economics, right? My financial situation is really no different than a city's financial situation. If I come up against a tough time, what do? I sell what I can, maybe not what I should. So do I sell my prized BG collection? I don't want to, but I do because I need the cash. Cities, do they sell Midway Airport? Not because they want to, but because they need the cash to pay for education to make the city competitive. And what is the political will to do that? The U.S. is uniquely uncompetitive on the issue of privatization, and that is criminal. And the political backlash against that is, why would we sell tomorrow's revenues for today's gain? And the reason is education. Why would you undereducate a kid and make them less competitive and make cities less competitive to become an asset manager?
But remember, we lease the Skyway, $2 billion. We use it for short and long-term investment funds. We use it for hard infrastructure. We use it for social infrastructure, dealing with after-school matters, homeless, different issues that people can feel and see it. You're right, the federal government has never done it. State governments haven't done it. They've tried to do it. But you need a public, private, and non-for-profit partnership. If you don't do that in America, we're failing infrastructure, we're failing schools. But at the same time, the school is not the place where a child learns alone. It has to be a learning environment environment. After school, you can't say children are going to sit in class for 8 hours by osmosis, they're going to learn. You need a good quality instructions for 4 hours. Then you need after school programs. You need a Saturday program. And during the summer, you can't have children 2.5 months off of education. You're kidding yourself. Everybody, all the wealthy families send their kids to camp. We all did that working, but you have to create a learning environment during the summer and a learning environment in the community. If they don't have it, the places of worship. We have to talk about learning environments. This idea that we can only say schools, that is part of it. And I firmly believe it. I took over the schools in '95. We had the business community there. All the changes we made military academies, math and science academies, charter schools. It's getting better. But again, you have to bring the educators from elementary, high school, and city colleges together and say we can work together.
So, Mayor,
it's a learning environment.
Let me ask you, picking up Meredith's point, because I think you guys are agreeing vociferously. The question that Meredith is raising is how do you pay for it? And are we at an inflection point now? Because there has been, Mayor Daley's done some great things. There's some great examples around the country, but generally there's been a lot of political resistance to the type of widespread privatization that if we don't do now, the answer is the money's just not going to be there. So how do you break through
Well,
that?
but the money is there, and that's the problem, or that's the challenge.
right.
Mayors and cities are in the quality of life business. And quality of life includes education, includes public safety. It includes all the things that people want. And the reason why they're coming to cities is because they get a higher quality of life, and that's why the economic activity is there. The challenge we have is that when you talk things like privatization, we're having two separate conversations, because generally in the political market we talk privatization from an operational standpoint. And really, privatization is most effective from the capital standpoint. There's trillions of dollars of capital in this world that could be redirected. We have set up a system, or live in a system, that never utilized private capital in the public sector. We didn't have to. Post World War II, we've been we haven't had to. We've been able to finance what we want. The reason why privatization and capital projects has thrived in other places of the world, they didn't have the money. The government had to go to the private sector. We never have. We're at a point now where we need to face up to the realities we talked about, Dan and Rick. We have to go to the private sector because there's not money coming from Washington to cities.
Right.
We don't have it. And frankly, in many ways, we don't want it, because the second that the federal government is involved in any of my projects, it basically forecloses any private involvement. I mean, doesn't limit it, it shuts it out. And in a lot of ways, the state laws are just as restrictive. Cities would forge these partnerships, would bring in these trillions of dollars of capital to increase quality of life, to change educational system, if we could. But our discussion is generally on the operation part of privatization, as opposed to the effectiveness of bringing capital to the table. And we're precluded from doing it because of restrictions from above generally.
Rick, why don't you take it and then Dan?
Bringing in private capital, I think, is a great idea. But and it depends on the asset class you're talking about. There's certain things that government can do better without privatization.
Right.
And there's certain things that private industry can do better.
But it'd be great to have that on the table, though, those options on the table.
No question about it. But I would also take a step back, and I would say there may not be a money issue in the cities. There may be an allocation of the money.
Yeah.
I think there's sufficient money. The question is, how are you spending the money? And what is your expense side? So part of the issue that I worry about when cities start talking about selling off assets, if you ran your business and you kept selling off your assets in order to satisfy your P&L problems, you will soon be out of business. Right?
Well, it's not a mutually exclusive issue, right?
No,
You've
but
got to deal with everything.
if you think in the city of Los Angeles there's not enough money to develop proper education, you're crazy. There's an enormous amount of money in the city of Los Angeles. It's not being spent properly. The majority of the money in the city of Los Angeles is being spent on a pension system that can't sustain itself. So until you fix fundamental problems, I would say very boldly, which will probably create a whole bunch of ripples, but I think it's important to say, let some cities go into bankruptcy. Let them go into bankruptcy. This whole idea of too big to fail, this whole idea that people's lives will be destroyed, probably not, because you can't continue to sustain the economics of many of these cities. And I don't know about Mesa, I don't know about Chicago, but you ran a very efficient city. But Los Angeles is at the point it just can't fix itself.
So, but
So
let me-
you have to break it apart.
Go ahead, I'm sorry. So but I want to get you, Dan. But since we talked about bankruptcy in municipalities, I can't resist to turn back to Meredith a second. What's your reaction to Rick's point? Is the answer to let some of these municipalities, or they're going to go into bankruptcy anyway, whether we declare
Or let them go to the edge.
I think so. The precedent is when you only get political solutions when you're at a precipice or when people see the consequences. So what you've seen today is taxpayers bear the brunt of the consequence of over-leveraged government. So you're paying more and getting less. Now you're seeing pensions renegotiated. So you thought you had a said deal and now it's reconfigured. And then the bondholders is a different issue, and Stockton is dealing with that. Bankruptcy is not a great solution for anybody, but if it scares the sense into other
I just don't think
areas,
there's political will.
I agree with you. So the point being is Central Falls, Rhode Island, scared the daylights out of the rest of Rhode Island, and Gina Raimondo did some extraordinary things with it. Oh, you okay?
Back.
I
with
got
the,
you back. I
don't
just
wanna
want
lose
you to
you.
know that. Got you back.
It obviously,
I almost fell off the chair.
I was going to say, it obviously scared Mayor Daley, too.
Scared Rhode Island into making some of the most ahead of the curve changes to the pension system. And I think that, to your point, is exactly, sadly, what it takes to make real, to elicit real political courage.
Let Dan take over Griffith Park.
Yeah, please.
I mean, seriously.
But
We'd
have
love
to-
to do
We have
Pushman Square.
we have a park system in Los Angeles that is sad and embarrassing. You wouldn't want your kids to be in most of the parks in the city of Los Angeles.
Let me react to...
Take over everything, Dan.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's great to have your support. I agree with Meredith about it's a crime privatization isn't used more. And let me react to a couple of things the mayor said. I disagree with Mayor Daley on blue and red not necessarily differing in this area. I have a standard pitch when I go into a group of well-to-do owners who abut a public space that starts with me explaining why the private sector can do better. And we just opened a park in Dallas that's fantastic. It's between the Art District and Uptown Dallas, called Clyde Warren Park. The person who might be known here who's involved is John Muse, the private equity guy. But it's been a great project. I get into my pitch about point 2 or 3, and they start waving. And they say, Dan, you're in Dallas. You don't have to go through this. We accept that the private sector should do everything. No. Government has been ruled out.
Yeah.
So save that pitch for the Northeast and California. They get the red state, blue state difference. Now here's the problem on the political will. Meredith mentioned Central Falls. Most of the bankruptcies, I think, are going to be, there will be exceptions, but they'll mostly be in blue states because they're on the unsustainable path more than the red states are. That's just where privatization is a dirty word. I have a slide that I'm not showing today that says states where I use the word privatization. And it stops in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I don't use it east of that point, and I use it east of the High Sierras, but not west of the High Sierras, the Cascades. And I'm making an exception today. But
Dan, can I ask you just...
there is a huge difference in the reception in those different areas.
Well,
Just track the election returns. Where
but
Romney
sure-
won,
But
it's
I want to
easy.
talk about, you have to have public involved. You have to have the taxpayers involved. We did Millennium Park. We put $250 million into Millennium Park, business community $300 million. You have a responsibility. I mean, if you're a mayor, you take the partition, you take your city colleges, Board of Education, you all work together. And you can basically make compromise, you can cut costs, but you need government to participate in parks. You just can't give it up to the private sector. I disagree with that. You have to have some participation. If it's 10 or 15 or 20%, they have to feel the taxpayers are part of it, and it's not strictly private. I mean, you can take private money, but my relationship is always have public-private. If you don't, then everybody says let the private sector pay for everything.
Well, he did a very smart thing. Whenever there would be a project the mayor was trying to get done with the symphony or an art museum,
Yeah.
he'd take a developer who wanted something else from him, and he'd say, you're going to have a new pro bono job. I heard this from your staff. Your pro bono job is managing the symphony project for me and helping my public agency or my nonprofit do it, which is really smart. So he knew how to use the private sector. Let me
But
give
also you create tax increment financing. You take districts all over the city.
works in
You put
Illinois.
money back into housing, into schools, into municipal buildings. In other words, the growth of that tax base is spent in that district, in that community.
But that was my point. Build up those local communities. I agree.
Which brings up an interesting point, because it's not an either or when you're talking privatization. We're talking about smarter cities. It's smart to create partnerships. There are things that not only government should do, there are things that government can do because of our structure, because of government should be patient money. I mean, what's your ROI on investing in a park? You know, to me, it's not financial.
Or a library.
Or a library.
Or be a facilitator.
You can be a facilitator.
Be a sponsor.
The challenge is that it is all too often it's created as an either or, and it needs to be the kind of partnership, and we don't leverage that enough. We don't leverage those
Good government is also a cheerleader.
So let's get. I want to get this off the theoretical, because we don't want to have a graduate seminar here. What are the examples? Right, we're saying it doesn't have to be a pure privatization, and we don't want it to be complete public funding because the money's not there. What are the examples? Obviously, Bryant Park, where you can actually create a a reliable, long-term revenue stream that will draw the private capital. Because my impression sitting in a bank is if you can do that, there's plenty of money that's available to go in.
Peter, let me give you I'm going to criticize Boston and Philadelphia right now. Mayor will enjoy this.
No, good taste. I like Philadelphia.
Here is a perfect example of not paying attention to the revenue side of your budget. Boston and Philadelphia have events departments, thinly staffed, and when somebody goes and wants to have a picnic in Fairmount Park, they go through this unit. And if to use something from Bryant Park, if Bill Gates wants to introduce Windows XP in a public space in the East Coast, he goes through the same unit that just issued a picnic permit 2 minutes ago. And both of those cities, and to some extent in New York, where there's not privatization in place, you have to have a rate card for public events, and you're not allowed to consider the ability to pay of the entity. So we don't do that. We don't have a rate card. People approach us and we say, how disruptive is this? How much does it bar the general public from use of the park? And, very important, how much can this entity pay? Bill Gates did a concert with Sting in 2001 to introduce Windows Office or Windows XP, $350K. And they said, where do we write the check? Who do we make it out to? No argument. $350,000 to run part of Bryant Park for a couple of months, because Microsoft was willing to pay. But those two cities I mentioned would have charged him $100, same amount as for a family reunion picnic. We do a lot of dumb things in the cities, and the New York City Parks Department doesn't do that, by the way. They're very smart.
So I'll give you just a real quick.
That's a tiny example.
Yeah, I'll give you a real quick example that we're involved with. The city of Glendale, local city here, put out an RFQ for redevelopment. It used the redevelopment agency, which unfortunately now in the state of California has been disbanded, which I think is a mistake, which should be talked about. But nonetheless, we invested, we've got roughly $500 million invested in a project called the Americana brand. In the city of Glendale, we are now the second largest taxpayer. We have a shopping center that's doing about $1,200 a square foot, 3 times the national average in terms of sales. We're adding a brand new Nordstrom. Bloomingdale's is opening up about 500 feet up the street from us. It has changed the dynamic of that city, and through the downturn, that city sustained itself because of the incremental taxes that are created from the sales tax, the property taxes, and by the way, there's downtown living now in condominiums and apartments, and it's changed the nature, and sort of this flywheel that starts picking up pace, the whole area is starting to get redeveloped. That is a public-private partnership that has worked out magnificently well. And it does raise the issue of the limitations now that cities have in California because there are no more redevelopment agencies. Right. So that tool is now gone from cities, and it needs to come back in some form.
Okay, so wait, I want to keep going, but why don't we? I think there's some microphones. If people want to start teeing up some questions, I want to go down the line just real quick. Finish it with Mayor Daley. So give us either a best example. Dan gave us both a best example and a worst example or bad example. Give us a best practice in terms of really leveraging the assets to create the kind of revenue that's needed, small or large, and give us the worst practice you've seen, or either one.
Well, I think one of the things you have to, when you look at privatization and leasing public assets, you have to always sell on a high, not on a low. That's one thing. You have to figure out the value, and you have to work with people, and what is the best value you can get for the taxpayers. And so if you're ready to lease any assets and the market's not good, you cannot go ahead with that. And that takes a lot of political courage to tell people that you're not going to go ahead with it. And that's one of the issues that mayors have to deal with. But at the same time, my theory is that you have to use the private sector. They have to come with expertise, technology, and not be afraid of the private sector. You can outsource. We outsourced all the janitorial services in the city for years. We had a union. It's a good union. They get paid decent salaries, which you want. And so let's not say with cities that everything is bad with cities. I mean, from my viewpoint, they're changing. They have to change. Some have historical problems. Yes, they do. But like anything else, they're going to be flexible. You see Boston reinventing itself. You see Philadelphia with great universities reinventing. Look what's happening in New York City. I mean, you thought it was going to collapse. It's not collapsing. And so what we have to do is each mayor, in working with other mayors, because we're not going to compete against each other, look at best practices. Ontario has a great infrastructure fund. They use their public pension funds. The great pension funds of Canada use it for the pensioners and use it for the betterment of their city and the quality of life. And that's what we have to get back to. If you look at the whole structure of pensions, if we consolidated all of them in every state, no local pension funds, consolidate them all, one major pension fund, no one in government can be on it, oversee it, outsource everything. You have money for infrastructure, have money for schools, and everything else. But again, that takes real courage, not only from a mayor, but from the state and in Washington, D.C. Mayors have a lot of courage. They've done a lot of things. And that's what we have to get back to. They're on the front line continually.
Mayor?
I think the poster child for best practices in terms of governorship is Mitch Daniels of Indiana. And so the single best privatization is Indiana's toll roads. He bested private equity. And
wait, before that, we did the toll road. Do you know that? He followed me. So let's put this into perspective.
So the best example is
And
how
the
Mitch
worst
Daniels
case-
followed.
But-
I had to go down
How
and
smart he
convince
is.
Mitch Daniels.
Okay.
I had to go down to the General Assembly, convince Democrats to vote for it. But like anything else, you had to convince him to do it. He did not do that on his own.
well, it was an indirect compliment to you, right? So
No, I'm just telling you the truth.
and I know that.
I drove
so
on the
worst
toll
case
roads.
scenario
Do I
is
get credit
or
for that?
worst example is Big Dig in Boston.
In Boston, right. Mayor?
You know, sometimes it's not the gigantic projects that set a culture, because we're talking about a culture change here. We need a culture change in America because we're not living in the days of unilateral prosperity. The world is prospering, and we need to adjust to that. I'll give a good example in Mesa. I'll brag about what we did. In most communities around the country, our fire departments also handle medical calls, and we're not unlike others where 80+% of our annual calls to our fire department are actually medical issues. So we're sending a $750,000 fire truck out with 4 highly trained professionals to fix somebody's sprained ankle or their fever or whatever. And we said we can't keep doing this. So what we did is we teamed up with a local hospital, and we're precluded from charging for that by state law. We teamed up with a local hospital, and we now send out a much smaller, it looks like an ambulance. It's called a TRV, Transitional Response Vehicle. We send one paramedic and a physician's assistant or a nurse practitioner who works for the hospital or a private practice. They go out after we've filtered the call. They go out, and if there's that sprained ankle or that fever, whatever, the nurse practitioner takes care of it, can actually prescribe them, or sets up an appointment for that person to go to a doctor. Therefore, we don't send out the fire truck. We don't send the person doesn't end up in the emergency room,
right,
clogging it up and creating uncollected bills. And if they do have insurance or whatever, the nurse practitioner actually can bill for that. And so it's a win-win-win. We're now looking to expand that. Those are things that are changing our culture because we're looking for these types of strategic partnerships.
That's great. Let's say, I think there's was there something back there? Yeah, got it. Oh, go ahead.
John Graff from the Reason Foundation. We focus a lot on privatization. This is a question for the mayors. One of the things that seems to be a huge problem in cities is the unions. And how do you privatize services when you're going up against the unions? Look what happened in Los Angeles with the parking structures. Look what happens in various cities as you are trying to privatize services that are really not a core function of government. What's your answer? How do you get around that? How do you actually get these projects done?
Well, first of all, when you look at a project, you look at the workforce. You find out how many are retiring, things like that. Then you make room within your budget to move them over. Those are left, move them over into the budget, doing decent jobs there. And then in turn, then you look at a privatization. Or you work with the unions going to represent them in the private sector. And that's the other thing. And then you move them over from the same union, basically representing the workers. But you have to have a good working relationship. You have to really look at what asset you want to lease and what the workforce is, what's a retirement, and you can figure that out. And that's why you have good financial people. And you go to the private sector and have them evaluated as well. And there are successful stories all over the country. Most cities have done that. Very few states have really done this.
Well, that example I just used with our fire department, obviously we work with our firefighters union. And what we did is that we took a long-term approach and made a good argument that we were actually ensuring that long-term there would be job stability. That this was not a takeaway, it was actually a stabilization. And you have to be legitimate and be honest with that. I work well with my unions. We don't agree on everything, but we have an open dialogue and we talk about long-term as opposed to the next quarter. And when we're doing things, you got to have that approach.
Remember, in the city of Chicago, all the public employees have to live in the city. They don't have the pleasure of living, 30, 60 miles in another state. They have to live in the city.
So, let me ask the mayor of Bryant Park to weigh in.
They're all middle-class workers.
We have a different answer. Just say no. Give me a couple examples. Mayor Booker in Newark, we're doing a park with him. This is not public, so there's some
now it is.
Now it is.
We have a $1 million gap between prevailing wage and what the park really should be built for, and we're stuck. And the way it's going to get solved, as always in Newark, is Ray Chambers and Prudential are going to put more money in that easily could have gone to poor neighborhoods to pay 13 guys who are going to make much more money than they should because the state has a prevailing wage mandate. It's a terrible waste of money. Bryant Park, we have a skating rink. So I got a call from the Union of Electrical Operating Engineers or something one day. There are chillers that run the rink. Nobody watches them all day. They work all day. They keep going. So this guy says, we got a great idea. We're going to send you 5 guys at $150,000 a year to watch those chillers. Make sure there's no explosion. So I said, I got a better idea. I'm hanging up on you right now. and so far, everybody says you're going to get, I did get threatened, but they didn't say we're going to kill me. They said they'd break my head, so I thought I'd be injured. Now I'm waiting to see who wins the mayoral contest, because if a friendly to the union's person wins, I may get a call from City Hall saying, I think we should negotiate this a little bit. But if we negotiate this, there's no free skating for kids in Bryant Park because nobody said no. So I've just had to say no. And the unions in those states, somewhat different in other states, definitely Arizona and to some extent Illinois, very bad situation in the Northeast and California. You really can't do things in a rational manner.
Dan, you bring a really interesting question for both you and Rick. How much political risk do you have to calculate in that you'll get some new administration who doesn't believe in this and says, okay, it's time to take back Bryant Park, we shouldn't be, giving it to Bill Gates.
That's why I'm geographically diversified now. When I was only in New York, there was too much madness that could descend on me at any point. So we're in different states and cities because I'm worried about that very much.
Rick, do you
I would rather not. We've done one redevelopment project, which is in Glendale. The city of Glendale has been great. It was prevailing wage. It drove up a lot of costs for no good reason. But every one of our projects is our own balance sheet with our own money, and I'd rather not have government money because I don't want to have to deal with it. I would just prefer to have government be a facilitator and not be a barrier, and then let us do our thing and invest our own capital.
All the states have prevailing wages, not local government. That you have to remember that they have the prevailing wages.
Yeah, the state.
But in Millennium Park, we've outsourced almost everything there.
The prevailing wage is a huge issue because we're dealing with an issue with it now up in our project up in Montecito, and it makes no sense. It adds another $7 million to the project for what? Let it be competitive.
By the way, the mayor mentioned earlier, Mayor Daley mentioned federal mandates. There are a lot of horrible examples of that. We haven't talked about that much. I'm at a Phillies game with a friend of mine, and I bring binoculars to baseball games when I go. I'm looking out at the bullpen, and I say, Joe, what's that structure in the corner of the bullpen there? Phillies bullpens are on top of each other. He says, our handicap ramp for the bullpens. So I said, Joe, when was the last time the Phillies had a handicap reliever out there? And he said, yeah, and I have no idea why they did it, but it was in the paper. It was known this was going to happen. And we called HOK, which did the stadium, and they said, we put in handicapped access elevators to any elevated bullpens because of ADA, which has a phrase about recreational facilities. The bullpen of Citizens Bank Park is a recreational facility, so we had no choice.
Let's try to get a couple more. Here and then in the back. Yeah, I've been looking. Do we have a mic over here?
I have the mic in the back.
Yeah.
Okay, do that.
He's up here, though.
And then why don't you bring the mic up here? You go first, and then
Okay,
you.
thank you. At the beginning of the panel, both Rick Caruso and Dan Biederman talked about the livability of cities. But I'm astonished we've had this 45-minute plus conversation. Nobody has mentioned crime in the wake of one of the highest murder rates in Chicago's history. And if I recall, part of Bryant Park was not that it was just dirty, but it was also very dangerous. And I'm wondering if, Dan, maybe you or any of the others might be able to talk about how important crime is to what a smarter city actually is.
Well, critical, and Rick deserves a lot of credit. He bought Bill Bratton out here. We were just talking about it. New York City, this is partly me, but mostly not me. This is other people. New York City brought its stranger on stranger homicide rate down this past year. We're now heading for 420 murders in a city of 8 million people. That's an incredible achievement because all the experts say there are about 200 murders that would have been created by people who know each other that are family disputes and the like. So 200 murders versus 2,000 25 years ago of strangers based on excellent police work. And Bill, we're both great admirers of Bill Bratton, and he did that. And a lot of other cities have brought their rates down. So that was absolutely critical. And the theories that Bratton has pursued, broken windows theory, invented in Boston and Newark by some brilliant guys, and CompStat and other things that a lot of cities have used.
And I can tell you that that's a trend across the country. And I know, regardless of what you hear of Arizona, you hear all these things about how we're being overrun with the drug cartels, and that's an issue. In Mesa, our Part 1 crime, our violent crimes, are at levels that we haven't seen since 1961. And so we talk about a violent society, we talk about the impression that people around the world have, but like in Arizona, through these kind of policing and through a lot of city planning and stuff goes into to integrate city plans and neighborhood plans and park plans that create situations. And like I said, we think that the 50s and the 60s were this real nice, quiet period, and yet we're now down to crime levels below what happened in 1961 and 62.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment. Once I left office, I'm not commenting upon the mayor because it's a respect for the office. But one thing technology is needed in every city, and New York's proved it, Chicago, other things. And Boston approved it. They solve the crime by cameras. Simple as that. It prevents crime and it solves crime in a much quicker and efficient way, and you save money. So London has led the way, Chicago has led the way for years, and you have to put more cameras up in public ways. Not in the private sector, in public ways, over parks, streets, alleys, any entrance, dealing with public ways. And then you have to have the siege of guns. Guns are rampant, and the more guns you seize, you reduce the shootings and murders in any city.
Ed White?
Yeah, good morning. Two-pronged question. One for the mayors, talking about infrastructure, and then the second is for the developers, infills. And I see what you've done on Burton Way. That's in the city of Beverly Hills, if I'm correct.
City of LA.
City of LA.
Right
Okay,
across on the
across.
Beverly Hills border.
Okay, so with the infrastructure, you're just talking about 2050, you're going to have 70% of the population of the world in there. The cities can't maintain the infrastructure that they have now. Where is that money going to come from? And then for you as well.
Infrastructure. Bridges, canals, ports, that's our greatest challenge because infrastructure investment has driven the economy of this country since the Erie Canal and the early days, and we've been the leader in the world. We're not the leader in the world anymore. We're falling behind once again because we did a great job post World War II and we've let it slip. That's the big question, and that's why we have to get creative. We know money's not coming from Washington, and yet with the mandates, with the strings attached, we have to open new ways to get creative, and that includes this trillions of dollars of private capital that's sitting on the sidelines that needs to be invested because the investment we make in the infrastructure, for every dollar invested in the interstate highway system, there's a $6+ financial return. The dumbest thing we do in America. And it's the dumbest thing to do in Washington is to treat every expenditure the same. For them, an operating expenditure is the same as a capital expenditure. We don't do that in the cities. We in Mesa, at the same time we were cutting our budget, our operating fund by 20%, we upped our infrastructure investment. We built freeways. We built off-ramps. We invested in new sewers and new water because we treat that as a capital investment, an economic investment that reaps rewards. The cities are leading that. We just need the states in Washington to basically get out of our way.
Yeah, the city needs the independence. You cannot take federal state money because they're protectors of government in regards to all infrastructure projects. And they don't want private sector money in it. But cities are trying to figure this out and try to do it in a private way, strictly with city money, without any federal state money.
Rick or Dan, did you want to comment? Hold on one second. I'm going to get to you.
The question on. Yeah, I mean, we love infill, projects. I like high barriers to entry. I mean, honestly, all the sort of issues with cities, typically politically, make an inefficient market. There's great upside in an inefficient market, right? If the market was purely efficient, you couldn't make money. So you take a look at 8500 Burton. That's a project that we got completely rezoned. We avoided doing a full EIR because we work very closely with the neighbors. We always have for years and years and years. So we took a piece of property that was zoned for 2 stories and no retail and no residential. We built 8 stories with 87 residential units and a market, and we reset the rents on luxury living in Los Angeles. So, but I think that's more of a story of if you work smart as a private developer, work closely with the community up front, get them engaged and really give them ownership. Because my theory has always been, with all due respect, elected officials typically do not want to make decisions that may threaten their re-electability. So if you get the community behind you, then demands that your project get built, it makes it easier on the elected official and you get through it. So the fact that we built that project without an EIR on a mitigated negative deck was pretty remarkable, but our team did a great job.
Last question over here. Make it a quick one.
Okay, thanks. Esther Dyson from New York City. I was really happy to hear Meredith talk about education and long-term spending. I'm curious whether any of you pulled a Michael Bloomberg and did anything to improve the health, nutrition, education, stuff like that in your cities, because that's what's actually going to make them viable long-term.
I talked about quality of life, health, education. Those investments are what are essential to cities. And by the way, as the U.S. Conference of Mayors president, I need your help. Please, there's a lot of you out there that can make a difference, that can make things happen. Give me your business card. I'd love to hear from you as to what we can do in cities. Cities are where the action is. Cities are where the economic activity, 90+% of the new jobs in America are being created in cities, and it gets back to the quality of life we can provide, and then gets down to the basics: crime, education, those kind of things.
How to do it smarter.
Well, I was proud in '95 to take responsibility. All the Democrats voted against me in Springfield, but I took responsibility. I didn't blame anyone, didn't blame teachers, didn't blame anyone. Just go on and how do you improve it? Private sector came in, charter schools, public schools, reinvested in all new schools, remodeling schools, new math and science academies, military academies. We're the only city teaching Arabic, Russian, and Chinese. We're the largest Chinese program in the country. You have to change the culture of education. That's in the universities as well, and not just in local education. You have to, in city colleges, you have to say we're all one, let's all work together. And when I hear people condemning teachers, I've always told a president of a university, have you ever fired a tenured teacher in a university? No. So all of a sudden, we're trying to say every teacher in America, local, should be fired because they're not great teachers. And so my perspective, let's work with them. Let's really work with the schools of education in your universities to get better quality teachers. And let's basically work with them in regards to after-school programs, creating a learning environment. This idea, condemning teachers, I think is the worst thing for America.
Okay,
we may have differences.
I want to take 20 more seconds. So other than your own city, everyone tell us one city or mayor around the world who we should be looking for innovation and progress. Dan?
I suspect, I don't know the person, but I suspect that person is going to be found in those west coast of South America's countries that have privatized smartly and east of the Iron Curtain.
Okay. Rick?
I think Bloomberg is on the top of that list. I mean, I think he's done an amazing job in New York City.
I'd say Mike Bloomberg.
Mike Bloomberg?
I'm a New Yorker, so I've got to say I can't say Mike Bloomberg.
Don't say Mike Bloomberg.
I would say London, and Bloomberg's had a lot of influence there too. So, but you can't beat him, right?
This is the Bloomberg conference? Okay, Mayor?
I know. I have the opportunity of meeting with hundreds of mayors throughout the country, and I think if you could get together, Mayor Daley and I were talking about this, with a group of mayors, big cities, small cities, you would have a lot of optimism because there's a lot of great things happening in a lot of cities. Innovation happens in cities. Cities are where the action is, and there's hundreds of mayors that I would point out because I try to learn from them.
Great. Thank you all for
So
being
give me
here.
your help.
Great
Give me your
discussion.
cards.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. It was fun.
Is that Brian parking it?
If only I could have you, just